Okay, this is part 4 of Andrew Gallimore's alien information theory that he put out in 2019. We are on chapter 8. Let's get to the text. It's like some kind of eyeball, kind of. I don't know. There's the other side of it. Quote, a lot can be said for the infinite miracle mercies of God, but the smarts of a good pharmacist, when you get down to it, is worth more. End quote. Philip K. Dick. Chapter 8, Psychedelic Molecules in the Brain. Okay, I think he's covered most of the really nerd stuff. Hopefully he actually gets to this DMT stuff. Coughed for a second. Anyways, neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers charged with transmitting information from neuron to neuron and throughout the brain. Released from the presynaptic bulb, these specialized molecules diffuse around the synaptic cleft to reach the postsynaptic membrane. Upon arrival, by binding to protein receptors embedded in the postsynaptic membrane, they can have a variety of effects on the postsynaptic neuron. Over 100 natural neurotransmitters have been identified, each with their own particular roles in the brain function. Most types of neuron will only secrete a single type of neurotransmitter, with a glutamate, dopamine, acetylcholine, and serotonin being some of the most important. Neurotransmitters are stored inside small bubbles of membrane, synaptic vesicles in the presynaptic terminal. When an action potential reaches the presynaptic terminal, a sequence of biochemical events is triggered, causing the synaptic vesicles to fuse with the presynaptic membrane, which releases the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. A synapse is usually a tight one-to-one connection between a presynaptic bulb and a postsynaptic membrane. Neurotransmitters are unable to diffuse out of the synaptic cleft and potentially affect other neurons. This allows synapses to form the precise wiring of the brain. Its structural connectivity, and as such, is referred to as wiring transmission. In contrast, other synapses are much more open, with a wider synaptic cleft, and allow the neurotransmitter to diffuse out of the synapse and have effects on large numbers of neurons at the same time. This is known as volume transmission versus wiring. And the neurotransmitters involved are given the name neuromodulators to distinguish their role from that of the wiring neurotransmitters. These types Each type of neuromodulator can bind to a specific set of receptors, each having a characteristic effect on the neuron in which it's embedded. For example, serotonin 5-hydroxytryptamine 5-HT can bind to at least 7 different types of serotonin receptor, each of which has a very particular effect. So serotonin's effect on a neuron is determined entirely by the types of serotonin receptor it possesses, if any at all. A typical neuron in the brain will contain receptors for a number of different neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, perhaps with several different subtypes of each. It's the volume transmission versus wired transmission. Singular versus plural seems pretty basic. Narrow cleft, all right, I guess this is more narrow and this is wider or larger, I guess, right? Narrow synaptic cleft means neurotransmitter provides a direct connection to the postsynaptic neuron. Wide synaptic cleft allows neurotransmitter to diffuse widely and affect a large number of postsynaptic neurons. One of the most common effects of a receptor is to alter the membrane potential of the neuron. If the membrane potential is raised closer to the threshold potential, known as depolarization, then the neuron is more likely to fire an action potential. Since the sum of EPSPs resulting from presynaptic activity is more likely to push the membrane potential over the firing threshold, this is also called excitation, often described as making the neuron more excitable. Some receptors have the opposite effect, lowering the membrane potential, known as hyperpolarization. Excuse me. Shouldn't that be like hypopolarization? No, guess not. Hyperpolarization and pushing it further away from the firing threshold. This makes the neuron less likely to fire or less excitable. Since the effect of a neuromodulator is determined entirely by the receptors to which it binds, the same neuromodulator might have very different effects on different neurons. And since neurons usually contain many different types of receptor, it can be difficult to predict the overall effect of a neuromodulator on any particular type of neuron. A 5H2A receptor, threshold potential, depolarization, resting potential. Okay, it goes up the threshold potential and it goes up to make it more excitable, and this depresses it or makes it less likely to hit that potential. So the 2A goes up and the 1A goes down, I guess. The serotonin 5-HT receptor subtypes 5-HT1A and 5-HT2A have opposite effects on the membrane potential. Serotonin 5-HT is the most important neuromodulator with regards to the effects of the classic psychedelics, which include LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. Pause. Throat is acting a little funky tonight. Sip of water here. Serotonin is secreted exclusively by small clusters of neurons at the base of the brain called the raphe nuclei. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Although the raphe nuclei form a small structure, the axons from their neurons spread out like long tendrils that can reach almost every area of the cortex. Serotonin has a number of roles in cortical function, but we'll be focusing only on only one. Its effects at a type of neuron known as pyramidal cell. As a pyramidal cell, these neurons form the main cortical component of the thalamocortical loops that are so important in building your phenomenal world. Pyramidal cells send their axons from layer 5 of the cortex to the thalamus and receive input from the thalamus in return, completing the loop. Excuse me. They get their name from the triangular pyramid-like shape of their cell body. Pyramid-like shape, huh? With dendrites protruding from the apex of this pyramid and projecting high into the upper layers of the cortex. These apical dendrites um, receive the inputs from the thalamus as well as from other types of neurons surrounding them in the cortex. Serotonin binds to specific receptors embedded in the membrane of these apical dendrites. There are 7 recognized classes of serotonin, 5-HT receptors of let me read, did I say classic? There are 7 recognized classes of serotonin 5-HT receptors, 5-HT1 to 5-HT7, with some of these classes also containing subtypes. For example, the 5-HT2 receptor class contains 3 receptor subtypes, 5-HT2A, 5-HT2B, and 5-HT2C, each of each with its own particular effects. The most important site of action of the classic psychedelics is the 5-HT2A receptor. And the potency of a psychedelic drug correlates quite closely with how strongly it binds to this particular receptor subtype. The blocking this receptor abolishes any psychedelic effects. So maybe this is what happens when people get this the alleged DMT lockout. It's because these receptors are blocking, or the receptors are being blocked by something else. I don't know, possibly. I wouldn't know because I haven't taken DMT to know any of this. Serotonin binding to the 5-HT2A receptor has a depolarizing effect on a pyramidal cell. The membrane potential is nudged towards the threshold potential. Serotonin also binds to 5-HT1A receptors, also found on pyramidal cells. But this has the opposite hyperpolarizing effect on the neuron. Activation of this receptor pulls the membrane potential further from the threshold, making it less likely that the neuron will fire. Since these two different receptors share space on the same neuronal membrane, they have an antagonizing effect on each other, with the 5-HT2A receptors exciting the pyramidal cell and the 5-HT1A receptor inhibiting it. As such, the balance between 5-HT2A versus 5-HT1A activation sets the excitability of the pyramidal cell and, by extension, the entire cortex. Huh. The thalamocortical loop. An axon from a thalamic neuron projects to the apical dendrites of a cortical pyramidal cell, which sends its axon down towards the thalamic neuron, completing the loop. Go down to there, thalamus, to the cortex, the apical dendrite, inhibitory interneuron. You haven't talked about that yet. Interneurons. There's the pyramidal cell, or at least, yeah, the neuron. Yeah. Anyways, as well as their antagonizing effects on neuron excitability, the 5-HT2A and 5-HT1A receptors also have opposing effects on gamma oscillations, which are important for integrating the pattern of T column activation to form a unified T state. Activation of the 5-HT2A receptor promotes gamma oscillations, whereas 5-HT1A receptors inhibit these oscillations. Under normal circumstances, it is serotonin that occupies and activates both receptor subtypes. tuning the excitability of the cortical pyramidal cells and setting the balance of cortical activation. The significance of this balance can be appreciated when it's disrupted. Hmm. The classic psychedelics bind selectively to the 5-HT2A receptor, but have little activity at the 5-HT1A receptor subtype. This tips the balance in favor of depolarization, exciting the cortex and promoting gamma oscillations in thalamocortical loops. Loops, you say? Hmm. This has two effects. Firstly, the cortex becomes more sensitive to incoming sensory information. The spikes that reach the cortex via the thalamus are likely to activate a larger number of T columns than they would in the absence of the drug. The reason for this is straightforward. Whether or not a pyramidal cell and by extension a T column is activated depends entirely on whether the excitatory postsynaptic potentials (EPSPs) it receives push its membrane potential over the firing threshold. When sensory information in the form of action potentials reaches the cortex, large areas of the cortex and so large numbers of T columns will receive this information. However, most of these columns will not be activated since the EPSPs will fail to push the membrane potential of the pyramidal cells over the threshold. By binding selectively to 5-HT2A receptors, psychedelic drugs set the basal membrane potential, the potential in the absence of stimulation of all the pyramidal cells, slightly higher. This means that more of these cells will be nudged over the threshold as the sensory information reaches the cortex. Furthermore, once these T columns are activated, they are more likely to successfully transmit their information to other T columns since they will also be more excitable. Overall, the overall effect is that sensory information is not only better absorbed by the primary sensory areas of the cortex, but is also more likely to spread to other areas of the cortex. The architecture of the thalamocortical connectivity usually controls the spread of information between columns, but this control begins to slip as the T columns become increasingly excitable and more readily activated by even relatively weak connections. By selectively binding the 5-HT2A receptors, psychedelics depolarize the pyramidal cell, increasing its excitability by pushing its membrane potential closer to the firing threshold. Okay, that's depolarizing going up and hyperpolarizing going down. The subtypes: pyramidal cell, apical dendrite, different receptors, right? Secondly, the enhancement of gamma oscillations by psychedelics means that activated T columns are more likely to be incorporated into an integrated T state, which contains all the information that constitutes a phenomenal world. Furthermore, since this enhanced gamma effect is widespread across the cortex, highly coherent gamma oscillations are likely to spread more freely, potentially even in the absence of incoming sensory information. T columns are recruited into novel activation patterns that aren't part of the normal repertoire of T states. The T state repertoire expands to include entirely new states. Normally, the intrinsic activity of the thalamocortical system provides the context for incoming sensory information, which is matched to this ongoing activity, selecting the and amplifying states from the T state repertoire. However, in the presence of a psychedelic drug, the inflated state repertoire means that sensory information may select completely novel T states. This sequence of novel T states is experienced as a profound change in both the structure of the phenomenal world and the way the world flows from moment to moment. The world shifts from being stable and predictable to being unstable, unpredictable, and novel. I mean, that's why McKenna's always talking about novelty and shit like that. Hmm. Colors appear brighter and richer. The boundaries between objects appear to blur. As objects blend into one another or reconfigure their structure and identify before your and identity their structure and identity before your eyes, the hose pipe on the lawn morphs into a coiled snake, or the pebbled driveway transforms into a bed of gleaming jewels. There might even be a blending of the normally well demarcated sensory systems, perhaps the visual areas of the cortex being recruited in response to sound information. Blue flashes accompany the dog barking across the street, or music from the stereo system elicits bursts of colored light that shimmer across the visual field. Isn't there a name for that? Isn't that synesthesia? Where your senses get um, kind of entangled together, and you can like hear hear smells and all kinds of weird stuff. Anyways, when a psychedelic molecule enters the brain, the world appears to change, and indeed it does change. The activation patterns of the T columns have changed, and this means the information generated by the thalamocortical system, the information from which your world is built, has changed. Again, we return to the idea that your world is built from information. When this information changes, so does your world. Intrinsic activity, normal waking state, psychedelic drug turns it into something else. Novel activation patterns, psychedelic state, novelty state. I don't see too much. Oh, okay. You get the all one color, and then it's white and gray. I guess gray, or is it blue? I don't. I got my blue light blacker mode on. Anyways, these effects on cortical activity can be visualized by using modern brain imaging techniques, such functional magnetic resonance imaging (fMRI), which allow the activity within the brain to be measured and monitored in real time, producing a visual image of activity in the various areas of the cortex. The connectivity of the brain is organized into networks, many of which are common across all healthy people. The brain areas that comprise these networks tend to be activated together and are associated with specific functions. For example, the so-called default mode network (DMN) comprises several brain areas and their connections, mainly located towards the midline of the brain, that are activated when a person is focused inwardly rather than on the outside world and are or on any particular task. Hence, this network is also known as the task negative network. Daydreaming, ruminating about the past or future, or thinking about oneself tend to be associated with activity in this network. Task positive networks, on the other hand, are outward-looking networks activated when an individual is actively engaged in a specific activity that requires attention, such as solving a math problem. I mean, this is a maths problem. Is that even, or driving? Is that even proper English, or is that like some kind of British English? I don't know. A maths problem. Strong connections within these networks help to organize brain activity and restrict the flow of information between cortical areas. Monitoring the activity within these well-defined networks provides a measure of how well the brain's information is organized. When an individual is given a psychedelic drug, a as predicted by their effects on pyramidal cells, these networks appear to break down. Activity ceases to be kept within the order of the networks and flows more freely between different types of network. Overall, the cortical activity appears more disorganized and random, which is the visual expression of the novel T states generated by psychedelics. As a brain evolves, it becomes better at generating a useful and informative model of the environment. This can be quantified as an increase in the mutual information between the brain and the external world. Psychedelics appear to temporarily reverse this process. The intrinsic activity information becomes looser and spreads more freely under the influence of a psychedelic drug. The information generated by the thalamocortical system becomes less constrained by sensory information, and the mutual information between the brain and the external world decreases. This doesn't mean that the psychedelic state or the phenomenal world experienced is any less valid or real, quote unquote, than the normal waking world, simply that the world has changed its structure. The thalamocortical system explores novelty states that fall outside its normal repertoire. In the normal waking state, activation of the DMN and TPN are well demarcated and anti-correlated. As the DMN is activated, the TPN is strongly suppressed, and vice versa. Within network connectivity, between network connectivity, active network activity. In the psychedelic state, there is a loss of differentiation between the DMN and TPN networks. Information begins to flow between normally separated networks, indicated by an increase in between network connectivity on functional MRI. So the rate this increases in the psychedelic state. What? So I guess this is supposed to represent the psychedelic state. It's possible that the brain actually generates more information during the psychedelic state than during the normal waking state. However, less of this information will be immediately useful from an evolutionary perspective. The brain is as much concerned with ignoring or filtering out information not considered useful in the immediate concerns of survival as it is with selecting important information. Since sensory information is not simply swallowed by the brain, but rather selects T states from the thalamocortical system state repertoire, information that doesn't match this ongoing activity has no effect on the brain and is effectively filtered out. However, since psychedelics expand this repertoire to include completely novel T states, a broader range of sensory information it will happen to match this activity, including information that would normally be filtered out. As a result, the brain becomes better at absorbing sensory information and the world becomes far richer as the thalamocortical system progresses from through a series of novelty states. However, this richer, expanded, and more flexible state of consciousness comes at a cost. Hmm. The brain must strike a balance between order and disorder. Like other complex systems, its dynamics sit at the edge of chaos. The organization of information using networks is essential for building a stable and predictable world that can be used to make judicious decisions about behavior. Locating food and avoiding predators, for example, requires the brain to know the difference. However, if the networks militate, militate a too stringent and inflexible form of order, then the potential for creative thinking, incorporating new ways of looking at the world, or simply reacting rapidly to the ongoing influx of sensory information would be compromised. At the opposite extreme, the complete disintegration of network organization would yield a highly flexible state of consciousness with the potential for immense creativity and novelty. However, such a brain would completely fail to organize the contents of the world into meaningful objects about which astute decisions could be made. The world would be utterly chaotic and confusing. By relaxing the order imposed by cortical connectivity, psychedelics shift the brain towards disorder and generate a richer, more flexible world without descending into chaos, with the potential for greater levels of creativity and novel thought than the normal undrugged state. However, a single amount of order must be sacrificed, and the psychedelic state is perhaps suboptimal from an evolutionary standpoint, at least in the long term. LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT are the big four, quote unquote, classic psychedelics, each built from either a tryptamine or a phenethylamide, phenethylamide, phenethylamide nucleus, but each with its own characteristic way of affecting the brain and changing the phenomenal world. However, the effects of DMT on the structure of the world are far more dramatic than those produced by normal doses of LSD, psilocybin, or mescaline. All psychedelics, including the many novel drugs derived from the classic psychedelics, modify the information generated by the brain and, in so doing, modify the world. Usually, the world that manifests under the influence of a classic psychedelic is an altered version of the consensus world. DMT, however, is exceptional. Giving given a sufficient dose, around 30 to 50 milligrams for an average person, the world is not changed, but rather replaced entirely. Whereas the other psychedelics partially reduce the mutual information between the brain and the environment, DMT reduces this information to zero. DMT is 100% reality channel switch. The DMT worlds bear no relation whatsoever to consensus reality. Bear no relation whatsoever. As a psychedelic drug reaches the brain, cortical networks begin to break down and lose their control over the spread of information through the cortex. Increasing the dose of a psychedelic tends to enhance this effect even further. A larger number of drug molecules reach the brain and binds to a larger number of 5-HT2A receptors. This increases the excitability of pyramidal cells even further, and consequently the intrinsic activity of the thalamocortical system becomes even more fluid, unstable, and unpredictable. At its extreme, this can lead to a complete disintegration of the phenomenal world and utter confusion, with the user tumbling into a maelstrom of fragmented forms with no point of reference in the outside world. All sensory information enters the brain freely, without constraint, activating an apparently boundless variety of novelty states without any relationship to each other or the environment. This confusion is typical of the early stages of a DMT trip. However, once this early phase passes, the DMT worlds no longer resemble maelstroms of confusion, but stable worlds of crystalline clarity. Whilst the DMT space is undoubtedly of immense complexity, it possesses a character all of its own and doesn't result from random neural activity. The DMT worlds are thoroughly alien, often indescribably bizarre, and yet possess a striking number of characteristic features commonly reported by a large number of users. Before discussing how DMT achieves this, let's look at these strange worlds in more detail. Yes, finally. What is that? Are those like two big eyes? How are we doing on time? We're doing pretty good. Chapter 9. An introduction to hyperspace. Is that like a little mouth? Like two big eyes and a mouth? Anyways, quote, I like to think that I am a rigorous thinker, and yet here I am telling you that elf legions await in hyperspace, one toke away. End quote, Terence McKenna. That's not my attempt at uh, impersonating his voice. Nature is the great visible engine of creativity. Um, Outside of laboratory studies, LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline are usually ingested orally. LSD, owing to its extreme potency, is usually prepared by soaking absorbent blotter paper perforated into square tabs, quote unquote, in a solution of the drug, which is then dried. These tabs allow the minute quantities that constitute a fully active dose to be easily measured out for consumption. Psilocybin and mescaline are most often ingested in their natural form. Psilocybin by eating any of the many varieties of mushroom of the psilocybe genus, and mescaline headset turned off. Sad trombone. And mescaline by chewing the dried tops, buttons, quote unquote, of the peyote cactus. Despite being present in an abundance of plants, DMT cannot be consumed orally in its natural form. Mono, Monoamine oxidase A, MAO-A, is an enzyme present in the gut that is important for metabolizing certain amino acids in food. In particular, MAOA selectively breaks down molecules that contain a single amine group, hence monoamine. Of course, this also includes DMT, which is rapidly destroyed by MAOA on entering the gastrointestinal tract. However, DMT can be rendered orally active by consuming a drug that temporarily suppresses MAOA activity, a MAO inhibitor or MAOI, allowing DMT to enter the bloodstream and reach the brain. This drug combination is the basis for the traditional Amazonian brew known as ayahuasca, which, in its minimal form, is a de- decoction of two plants, one of which contains DMT and the other a MAO inhibitor. The ayahuasca brew is extremely bitter and unpleasant, with most users struggling to gulp down the nauseating dark brown liquor before enduring several hours of violent purging. This limits its popularity as a means of ingesting DMT outside the traditional shamanistic ceremonies, and by far, the most popular mode of DMT ingestion is via the pipe. Freebase DMT is readily vaporized with a gentle heat, usually with a small glass pipe, and a full dose can be inhaled in 1 or 2 lungfuls. Care must be taken not to burn the drug, which not only destroys it, but also produces a highly noxious vapor, often described as tasting like burning plastic or making inhalation without coughing extremely challenging. Amongst DMT aficionados, there is much debate over the most efficient means of vaporizing DMT, which is seen as something of an art. A jet, a jet flame torch lighter is ideal, but since it burns with a hot, sootless flame, regular butane lighters produce large amounts of soot, which coats the pipe and obscures the DMT as it vaporizes, making it easy to burn. The most common practice is to empty the lungs fully before slowly inhaling between 1 and 3 lungfuls of the DMT vapor, with the final lungful being held as long as possible to maximize absorption into the bloodstream. Or some suggest the best approach is simply to inhale as much as possible, as quickly as possible, until holding the pipe becomes impossible. A quiet and comfortable environment, usually indoors, is preferred as is somewhere to lie down. Whilst outdoor DMT trips are not unheard of, a breakthrough trip is almost always experienced from behind closed eyelids, with little opportunity for enjoying the natural world. So a comfortable bed is in a dimly lit room is as good as any as good a place as any. Behind closed eyelids, that's also a Spangle tune. Hmm. The onset of the trip is both rapid and overwhelming, usually beginning before the user has exhaled the final lungful, and at which point the eyes are closed and the user lies back and holds tight. Initially, the Voyager is hurtled through a rapidly changing procession of complex visual imagery, described by Timothy Leary as like being, quote, fired out the muzzle of an atomic cannon by with Neo-Byzantine barreling, end quote. Sheesh. And often accompanied by a distinctive metallic buzzing or whirring sound as the drug takes hold. If the dose is sufficient, this complexity eventually gives way and the user bursts through a veil or membrane, sometimes heralded by a tearing or popping sound. That's pretty crazy. Actually, I guess it's a really tearing sound, popping sound into a completely novel domain of impossible dimensionality and teeming with entities of immense intelligence and power. Boy, oh boy, I want to play a Spangled tune right now. I still want to play a Spangled tune. Many DMT trips falter before reaching this breakthrough quote unquote phase, and the user is dragged back into the consensus world without having reached the other side of the veil. However, if the dose is properly prepared, the vaporization technique properly honed, and the lungs well seasoned, entry into the DMT hyperspace is assured. It's like a little alien looking dude. Maybe it's a machine elf. During normal waking life, let me say that again. During normal waking life, your phenomenal world is constructed by your brain as a model of your environment, this surrounding grid. In the same way, hyperspace refers to the phenomenal world experienced during a DMT trip and is a model of a higher dimensional environment to which DMT gates access. The later In later chapters, we will discuss the structure of this environment and its relationship to the grid in great detail. Once breakthrough is achieved, transfer to hyperspace is rapid and complete, as if the consensus world has been switched off and an entirely new world switched on, excuse me. Users typically describe this thoroughly alien world as being more real than ordinary waking life, and the lucidity of the experience is striking, with trippers typically able to experience the bizarre effects as if in an ordinary waking state. Not all DMT users enter the same type of world. And of course, we shouldn't expect that everyone thrust into an alternate reality ought to have exactly the same type of experience. If an alien was dropped onto a random place on Earth, his experience would depend on the geographical location he happened to touch down upon. Landing on a busy street during rush hour in Hanoi would be incomparable to landing on a barren, freezing Siberian tundra, and reporting back to his alien kin, he would describe two very different worlds. The regions of the DMT hyperspace that users find themselves tumbling into is largely, at least in experienced users, beyond their control, as are the types of entities encountered. With experience, however, some users can learn to direct their journey towards specific areas of hyperspace and into meetings with certain types of intelligent entity. Entry into hyperspace, especially the first time, is almost invariably accompanied by a feeling of overwhelming shock and astonishment. This is a normal reaction. These worlds are not just strange, but ineffably bizarre. I think that's the name of a Spangle album, The Tales of the Ineffable. Um, and seemingly impossible in their complexity and construction. Most users describe an unshakable feeling of absolute authenticity and the undeniable presence of extreme intelligence beyond anything that could be experienced in the consensus world. I wonder if this I wonder if this is like getting access to the Kordylewski clouds. That would be wild. Where was I? Because if the Kordylewski clouds are recording everything on Earth, and these clouds have been around, evolving for billions of years, who's to say it didn't evolve these DMT hyperspace or these hyperspace realities or worlds? I mean, it's information, and the Kordylewski clouds are recording its information being recorded. So I don't know. I mean, it's definitely worth thinking about. I would imagine. So where was I? Absolute authenticity an undeniable presence of extreme intelligence beyond anything that could be experienced in the consensus world. That sounds a lot like a possibility of, I mean, the Kordylewski clause being a candidate for that. The apparent impossibility of these worlds and their contents stems partly from two characteristic features of the DMT hyperspace that distinguish it from consensus reality: inordinate complexity and the perception of higher spatial dimensions, i.e., beyond three. Whew, can't imagine it. This complexity doesn't manifest as unbridled chaos or random configurations of bright colors and geometric forms, like geometric hallucinations. But in the words of author Graham Hancock, these worlds are highly artificial, constructed, inorganic, technological. Hmm. There is an undeniable sense that these realms are not merely novel domains of the mind, but alien habitats constructed by a hyper-intelligent hand, complete with the jeweled cityscapes and whistling machinery of a highly advanced alien society. Like like jeweled dribbling basketballs, they come running forth. Spangle tunes have a lot of Terrence McKenna quotes in there. This is, it is what it is. The ferocity of the initial entry phase into hyperspace will often overwhelm even the most seasoned traveler, and neophytes are advised against trying to make sense of their new hyperdimensional surroundings or to control the experience. At least for the first few journeys, it is advisable to relax as much as possible and simply observe. Often the construction of the DMT space rapidly transcends the merely remarkable and moves into the unambiguous impossible. The traveler is transported into realms of apparently higher dimensional structure, or presented with objects that defy the geometrical constraints of our universe. It isn't unusual for trippers to recount seeing objects from all sides at once, or observing additional spatial dimensions beyond the usual three. The direct perception of higher dimensional, i.e., above three spatial dimensions, objects is not possible within our three-dimensional reality. In fact, such objects are difficult to envisage at all, and the experience of doing so is almost always confounding. A 3D reality is subsumed by any higher dimensional system in the same way our 3D world subsumes a lower dimensional one, such as a 2D flatland quote unquote world. There's a little reference there in it. This not only provides an important clue as to the nature of the DMT world and its relationship to ours, but also as to the true structure of our brain complex. We will explore this more deeply in the chapters that follow. In addition to their inordinately complex structure, the hyperdimensional DMT worlds are made all the more compelling by their occupants, just as a sprawling alien cityscape would reveal the nature of its architects and residents before a single soul was seen, so the presence of supreme intelligence is felt from the earliest stages of the trip. A supreme intelligence, you say? Once they make their appearance, entities range from savage insectoid and reptilian aliens. Rutro, to benevolent amorphous beings of light. That sounds like plasma. But by far the most famous denizens of these fantastical realms are the sprightly, mischievous beings described as elves, quote unquote. Terence McKenna's expositions on these highly animated, is that even a word? Animated little creatures, which he dubbed machine elves, quote unquote, are legendary. Oh, is this the quote? No, I don't think it is. Oh, wait. Oh, quote, trying to describe them isn't easy. On one level, I call them self-transforming machine elves, half machine, half elf. They are also like self-dribbling jeweled basketballs about half that volume, and they move very quickly and change, and they are somehow waiting. When you burst into their space, there's a cheer. The gnomes have learned a new way to say hooray. I couldn't help it. I think that's after this part of the quote. A new way to say hooray is a Spangle tune. Um, End quote, I guess. McKenna also called them tykes, quote unquote, which perfectly captures their playfully impish nature. Whilst ubiquitous, they appeared in a variety of forms, ranging from amorphous balls of colorful light to the classic elves of Celtic folklore. Despite this variability, they seem to be unified in their playful character. The elves will often vie for the attention of the tripper and delight in demonstrating their skills, such as singing impossible hyperdimensional objects into existence. Singing impossible hyperdimensional objects into existence, or leaping in and out of the tripper's chest with much glee. Wow. Whilst the Uh-oh, we got a typo here. Typo. Whilst the elfin ones are some of the kookiest occupants of the DMT space, for many, they are generally seen as little more than a distraction from the more powerful beings that inhabit these realms. Yeah, I'll say. The comprehensive survey of the fauna would include a bewildering array of creatures, insectoids, reptilians, and serpents. I mean, there's the difference. Reptilians and serpents, elves, imps, goblins, and gestures, aliens, humanoid and otherwise, robots and cyborgs, rut-row, spirits, angels, demons, gods, and many other beings that defy categorization. We got the whole fucking gambit here. For any experienced voyager, it is clear that DMT hyperspace is not a liminal realm populated entirely by beneficent, uh, bene- uh, beneficent gods of light, but an extremely complex, varied, and vast hyperdimensional ecology populated by creatures that vary as much as in their character and intent as their outward form. Yes, yes, sir. The interactions between the tripper and these beings are more often than not positive. Often the tripper will find himself being carried or guided by a particular entity acting as a wise elder or protective spirit guide, eager to impart profound insights into the nature of reality. Insights most trippers struggle to carry back into the conscious world. Well, isn't that a shame? Occasionally, the more lively entities appeared simply to delight in the opportunity to show the visitor around the wacky circus. Of course, not all interactions are positive, and whilst violent aggression is, unfortunately, not that common, non-human entities with some degree of malevolent intent, or at least that are either visually objectionable or performing some unpleasant act on the user, are not frequently encountered. Yeah, we don't want to talk about that, don't we? The curiosity of an entity, which might initially be expressed by a gentle probing, can sometimes progress into something more invasive. Outright violence or maliciousness is rare but possible, and it takes both experience and a strong constitution to deal with entities manifesting in this way. Well, at least you're not gonna pull any punches as far as that goes, I suppose. Pause. One of the most uncanny types of experience reported by a striking number of DMT users is not only the sense that these entities were expectant of their visit, but of a great celebratory uproar upon breaking through into the space. Break on through to the other side. Supposedly. Quote, they keep saying welcome back in words like the big winner, he has returned. Welcome to the end of and the beginning. You are the one. Ruh-roh. As I looked around the room, I felt the sense of some huge celebration upon my entry into to this space. Bells were ringing, lights flashing. End quote. You are the one. Hmm. Interesting. This is often accompanied by a profound sense of deja vu, the unshakable feeling that one has been there before. Ruh-roh. In chapter 16, we will discuss exactly why this occurs. Yeah, I can't wait. Although the incomprehensible strangeness of the DMT hyperspace is astounding, the existence of such worlds is not the most astonishing revelation afforded by DMT. After all, even the most conservative of physicists would struggle to rule out the possible existence of parallel worlds inhabited by advanced alien intelligences. No, the most astonishing revelation is not the existence of such worlds, but that we have the ability to access them with such facility. By inhaling a couple of lungfuls of one of the simplest and most common molecules in the plant kingdom. It seems impossible to fathom how, when perturbed by such a simple molecule, the human mind can reach into such parallel dimensions of reality and meet intelligent beings that exist entirely independent of us. However, we must realize that DMT was embedded in our reality for precisely this reason, to enable us to access the hyperdimensional realm lying ortho, orthogonal to ours, orthogonal, orthogonal to ours. Rather than an alien realm, this is the realm from which we have become alienated, and the realm to which we will ultimately return. Resolution of the game. To fully understand how this can be achieved, we first need to understand the relationship between our universe and the DMT hyperspace. Zero. Oh, we're already up to chapter 10. Cormac McCarthy. How are we doing here? How are we doing? Oh, we're doing really good. Quote, he thought he'd seen tree branches in a yard beyond the window, filled with the small figures waiting for he, wizened and crouching, barbed and cat-eyed dwarfs with little codpieces of scarlet uh, puce, quote, end quote, Cormac McCarthy. Don't I have a book from him? Hold on a second. That name sounds familiar. I do. Blood meridian. Well, that's neither here or there for right now. Chapter 10, information flow through the grid. Why is this so big? The other chapters that weren't that big. Chapter headings, I mean. Vaporization of DMT in a small glass pipe remains the simplest, most reliable, and consequently most popular mode of entry into the DMT space. Within seconds of inhaling a lungful of DMT vapor almost before the pipe leaves the lips, the DMT molecules flood the brain and the world begins to change. If the dose is well measured and the vaporization technique adroit, breakthrough into the hyperdimensional habitat of the machine elves will occur only a few seconds later. Entry into the DMT space has only one absolute requirement: the flow of information from normally inaccessible dimensions of reality into the brain. DMT changes the information generated by the brain such that it can no longer be modulated by, no longer matches information being received via the usual sensory apparatus from our lower dimensional universe grid, but instead begins to match information being received from the DMT space. The brain loses the ability to sample information from our universe, but gains the ability to sample information from the DMT reality. Consequently, the brain stops constructing a model of the consensus world and begins building the DMT world. But the question remains as to how information to which the brain normally has no access can flow from these hidden dimensions into the brain. Before we can deal with this interdimensional information flow, we must first deal with the flow of information within the usual dimensions of our reality. Reality is built from information, and the complex forms that fill the world are complex patterns of this information, long self-organized in an emergent hierarchy of complexity from the level of the grid to the level of living and conscious organisms. The interactions between objects, quote unquote, in the world are the interactions between patterns of information. Everything is information and its processing. When these patterns of information interact, information is processed, information flows. If a glider on a two-dimensional cellular automaton scuttles across its grid and collides with another critter, the information from which the glider is built it is, after all, just a pattern of information flows into the other critter in a completely literal sense. The direction of flow is somewhat ambiguous, but we'll simply refer to this as sideways information flow. The flow of information within the same organizational level of a complex, hierarchically organized system. Let's see here. Regular information, sensory information going this way into the complex, I guess. Information from alternate DMT reality. Failed sensory matching. The 5-HT and the DMT. Failed. Okay, it switches. DMT information failed. And then now it's not failing, whereas the regular information is failing. It switches. I mean, he basically calls it a reality switch technology or something like that. I think that's the name of the next book. It chronologically, in the chronological order, his next book is called that, I believe. Anyways, when a photon of light is absorbed by an electron, causing it to leap to higher energy level, to a higher energy level within an atom, there is a flow of information from the photon to the electron. In fact, there is nothing other than a flow of information, and the electron's quantum numbers change in response to this. The electron computes its next stage. In, in chapter 3, we discussed how molecules inside living cells form complex networks of interactions. When a protein or other type of molecule inside a cell interacts with another molecule, it might modify the structure or change the way that molecule operates. This is simply the flow of information between molecules which are themselves, without wanting to labor the point, patterns of information. In fact, the entire workings of a living cell can be described as the flow of information through these complex networks of molecules. Rising to the macroscopic level, we observe the flow of information between neurons and the networks they form in the brain. The activity of neurons, the undulations and spikes of their membrane potential generate information that flows between neurons via the machinery of the chemical synapse. So, although your world is built from information, this information is not static. Information is dynamic. The dynamism of the information from which your world is constructed is never more apparent than during the peak of a DMT trip. Your world is built from information generated by the activity of your thalamocortical system, from the patterns of activation of the myriad columns from which the cortex is built, the sequence of T states. Psychedelics change your world by changing the activity of the cortical system, and so change the information that constitutes your world. Your model of the external world is altered. Modern neuropharmacological techniques have revealed the binding of classic psychedelics, including DMT, to a 5-HT2A receptor as being primarily responsible for these effects. Activation of this receptor causes pyramidal cells to depolarize, promotes gamma oscillations, and changes the patterns of information generated by cortical activity. These changes in information manifest as a change in the world you experience, which is the psychedelic state. The glider, spaceship, time. Yeah, they collided, I think. The information coded by the glider flows into the spaceship. Both are destroyed. Oh, both are destroyed, eh? I mean, it definitely does change. If we examine this process more deeply, we can view it as a flow of information. Information flows from the drug molecule to the receptor, and from the receptor it flows into the network of molecules inside the neuron. This ultimately has the effect of depolarizing the neuron, bringing it closer to its firing threshold. But the information flow doesn't stop there. Whilst the drug receptor interaction takes place at the molecular level, the psychedelic effect occurs at the highest level of organization of the brain, the level of global cortical activity. This isn't particularly surprising or mysterious, but it illustrates an effect known as upwards information flow, which occurs when behaviors or processes that occur at a lower level in an organizational hierarchy have an effect at a higher level. This type of information flow can be observed in all organized complex systems. In fact, upwards information flow is essential for complex systems to self-organize. For example, in a flock of starlings, we've seen how the adherence to a few simple rules by the individual birds, the bird level, causes the dynamic behavior of the flock level, to emerge. In a cellular automaton, such as the game of life, we've seen how simple update rules at the cell level cause complex high order structures to emerge at levels above the base grid. When a psychedelic molecule enters the brain, the information flows from the molecular level upwards through the organizational hierarchy to the level of the integrated T states that constitute your phenomenal world. Emergence is precisely the effect of information as it flows through layered complex systems and describes the layered complexification of the information from which all such systems are built. The relatively simple interactions between large numbers of neurons, the exchange of information between them, engenders the highly complex adaptive behaviors of the complete brain. We cannot necessarily predict the effect of information as it flows through the increasingly sophisticated levels of a complex system, which will depend on the on the system it's entering. At every level of the organizational hierarchy, information is generated. The form of the flock of starlings contains new information not present at the level of the individual birds. The birds contain the potential to form a flock, but the flock information, quote unquote, isn't generated until the flock itself forms. A drop of water contains the potential for every possible snake, snowflake form, but only the potential. The information in the form of the snowflake is only realized when the snowflake manifests as molecular level information flows to the to the level of the crystalline form. Crystalline A, higher level structures, upwards information flow, downwards information flow, mid-level structures, high level structures, mid level structures. Uh, they're not connected here, then they start connecting, and then they're basically all connected, but through this central one. For a second, I thought that looked like a certain symbol, but no, never mind. I was just seeing things. Anyways, remember, structures that emerge on the grid are not static objects, but processes. The dynamic processing of information, updating with every click of time. A complex structure doesn't emerge and then statically maintain itself. All forms constantly emerging. All forms are constantly emerging. Even an inherently static structure is built from cells that update themselves with each time step. Just as a whirlpool doesn't stop whirling once it forms, save it should disappear. The whirlpool is a dynamic pattern of information, a process, just as the critters that merge on an automaton grid are dynamic patterns of information. So it's important not to get confused between the idea of information flowing from through a complex hierarchical system that has already emerged and the information flow that causes the system to emerge in the first place. They are the same. Information flowing upwards through a complex hierarchy isn't simply passing through, it is actually generating the hierarchy. Whoa. As water flowing downriver gets caught in a whirlpool, the flow of water that maintains the whirlpool is not distinct from water that caused it to form in the first place. The whirlpool is a process that is not simply emergent, but is constantly emerging with each moment and will continue to do so as long as it manifests. I'm getting tongue tied for no reason, and will continue to do so as long as it manifests. Likewise, your brain is constantly emerging together with the world that manifests from beyond your eyes. Constantly emerging. Psychedelic drugs don't so much change the information generated by the brain as cause a different brain to emerge, has caused a different brain to emerge together with a different world. Why is this lowercase? It should be uppercase. Anyways, without upward information flow, self-organization would be impossible. The information being generated at the level of the grid flows upwards and causes fundamental particles to emerge. The interactions between these particles generate information that flows upwards, causing atoms to emerge, and so on upwards through the hierarchy to complex living organisms. Information being generated at one level causes the increasingly complex structures to emerge at higher and higher levels. This upwards information flow approach to understanding complex life is standard. Physics underlies chemistry and chemistry underlies biology. However, whilst being standard, it is incomplete. There is an upper limit to the complexity that can be achieved with upwards information flow alone. The new information generated at each level of an organizational hierarchy is not restricted to flowing only upwards to generate even higher levels of organization. This emergent information, the form and dynamics of the flock and the behavior of a complex ant society, can also flow in the opposite direction. And this downwards information flow is essential if we are to fully explain the emergence of life and eventually the unique properties of DMT. Downwards information flow occurs when information generated at a high level in an organizational hierarchy has effects on structures or behavior at a lower level in the hierarchy. Returning to the flock of starlings, the emergence of the flock can be partly explained in terms of upward information flow. The individual birds observe their closest neighbors and their flight speed adjust their flight speed and heading according to a few simple rules. This cause this causes the characteristic flocking behavior to emerge. Information flows from the bird level to the flock level. However, once the flock begins to emerge, the individual birds begin receiving and responding to information about the overall structure of the flock, its shape, direction of movement, and their own position within it. This is downwards information flow, since the flock information is only generated at the flock level, but affects the behavior of the individual birds, helping to reinforce the structure of the flock and augment its elaborately dynamic behavior. Downwards information flow exerts its effect by constraining the behavior of the lower level components of the system. The higher level emergent structure slash behavior constrains the behavior of the lower level components from which that uh, the higher the high it's starting back again. The higher level emergent structure slash behavior constrains the behavior of the lower level components from which that structure is built. The form of the flock constrains the flight patterns of the individual birds from which the flock is constructed. To make it clear why this is described as a downward flow of information, it's helpful to return to our definition of information as being generated when, quote, a system selects between a finite number of states, end quote. I mean, there's no need for a quote. Um, all of the all of the possible arrangements states of the lower level components of an organizational hierarchy form a space of possibilities or a kind of state space. By contrast, by constraining or selecting from this set of possible states, high level information generates information about lower level components, or if equivalently, information flows downwards, excuse me, through the levels of the organizational hierarchy. Imagine a snowflake crystallizing out of a drop, a drop of water. I mean, he's got it there 3 times, so I don't know why. It is said that no two snowflakes are alike. Such is the apparently infinite varieties of forms. That single drop of water, the countless water molecules and their innumerable interactions, embodies the potential form of all possible snowflakes. So how is one snowflake form selected from all other possibilities? As the geometric form of a snowflake crystal begins to emerge high-level information, it begins to dictate the position of further water molecules into the crystal. The glowing crystal, glowing, the growing crystal selects from the space of all possible arrangements of water molecules. Information flows from the level of a crystal form to the level of the individual water molecules. In the example of flocking, the form and dynamics of a flock of starlings, high-level information, constrains the flight dynamics of the individual birds, low-level information. High-level is apparently this, downwards information flow, low-level states ruled out, state selected. Oh, is it there 4A selects this one, and then that's that one. Okay. The low level. High level information selects from the possible states of the lower level structures, ruling out other states and generating information. Note that S1 through S4 are not lower level components but of the system, but possible states of and possible states slash arrangements of the entire set of components. In a living system, the role of downwards information flow is elevated from merely modulatory to absolutely critical. Life could not exist without the flow of information both up and down the organizational levels of that characterize living organisms. To be considered living, a system must maintain, regenerate, and reproduce itself over time. These are high-level behaviors that can only be performed by a complete cell, dependent on its entire emergent network of molecular components. But their effects often occur at the level of the individual components themselves. A damaged protein is replaced, a piece of the a piece of the membrane regenerated, a section of DNA repaired. Information generated at the cell level flows downward to the molecular level. Let's see, we pause here real quick. Okay, back to the text. We've already discussed at length how networks of neurons are responsible for generating information and controlling its flow throughout the brain. Certain networks, high-level structures, have algorithmic properties similar to that of computers, allowing them to control specific behaviors. The adoption of a very particular network state, an emergent high-level behavior that we might experience as a decision, might trigger the activation of specific synapses, lower level, that lead to a particular movement, such as turning the head or blinking. This is similar to how a computer software algorithm high level controls the switching of transistors low level inside the computer to achieve some outcome. And the headset conked out again. In both cases, information generated at a high level of organization modifies the information being generated at a lower level. Information flows downward. This two-way flow of information can set up potentially powerful feedback loops. Information generated by the low-level components of a system flows upwards and causes higher order information, structures, or behaviors to emerge. This emergent information then flows downwards, constraining the behavior of the very same low-level components that generated the high-level information in the first place. In certain well-tuned or evolved systems, this further enhances or reinforces the high-level emergent behavior. These positive feedback loops can occur at many levels of an organizational hierarchy, helping to stabilize and maintain the entire system of its behavior over extended periods of time. A living organism is a highly complex system of finely tuned feedback loops of this kind, from which emerge the dynamic but stable, responsive, and regenerative qualities that characterize life. Higher order structures, downwards flow, feedback loop, downwards and upwards flow of information establishes feedback loops that stabilize the entire system. Upwards flow, information flow, system components, complexity. Complexity goes up, yada, yada, yada. Of course, downwards information flow will occur to some degree between any two levels of an organizational hierarchy, and as such, information flows from the very top of the hierarchy to the lowest level, which would be the grid itself. Your brain and the phenomenal world is, and the phenomenal world it generates emerge from the moment by moment updates of cell states at the level of the grid, which new with a new emergent information being generated at every organizational level from the grid upwards, flowing up through the many layers of the complexity hierarchy to the level of global brain activity and consciousness. And of course, information also flows in the opposite direction from the level of the coordinated behavior of large areas of the cortex down to the level of the grid. When information generated at the cortical level, the information from which your phenomenal world is built is modulated by the action of a psychedelic drug molecule. This also changes the flow of that information downwards through the layers of organization to the level of the grid. DMT in particular elicits a highly specific and characteristic effect on his downwards information flow. The result is the gating of information from orthogonal dimensions of reality and the granting of an audience within the elfin folk that dance along the fractal hallways. To understand how this is achieved, we need to think a little more deeply about the relationship between our universe grid and the dimensions within which these beings reside. And I think I'm gonna call it, quits there. That'll be the end of this segment.